Welcome to the Happy in the Mess podcast. We are your hosts, Marlena, Sherry, and Matthew. We are therapists and coaches, and we want to share our own stories with you, as well as the wisdom, insights, and tips we've learned along the way. Thanks for tuning in to this episode.
Welcome, everyone, to the Happy in the Mess podcast episode. Here, we're going to talk about burnout today. And we started this podcast because it is difficult to be human nowadays. And so we are here with tips and tricks from the three of us who are therapists and coaches. And with us today, we have Sherry Timko, the relationship coach, Matthew Morgan, the misfit coach, and me, the dating and relationship coach. And like I said, we're going to talk about burnout, what it is, and what to do about it. And first of all, let's describe what burnout actually is. I think there's a lot of misconceptions about burnout, and we throw that term around a lot when sometimes there might be like comorbidities with burnout as well. So, how do both of you describe burnout, and what has it looked like in your own lives and your clients' lives?
Well, I'm going to start with this because I'm going to take the low-hanging fruit and leave the harder stuff to Matthew.
Yay!
So burnout is when, just overwhelmed, for such a long time that your body or your emotions or, I don't know, your thinking has a hard time recovering. Probably the difference between burnout and lots of other things is that you can recover fairly quickly, whereas other things are more deep-seated. When I think about burnout, I think about burnout of emotions. So that's when you've been responding maybe to your own emotions or to other people's emotions for so long without getting that break or that replenishment. Physical burnout, where you're in adrenal fatigue or you're in just not taking care of yourself to such an extreme that your body is kind of screaming out to please take care of it. And then relationship burnout, where you feel like your relationships are not fair, not equal. And so it feels like you're giving a lot more of yourself.
Thank you for that distinction of like how burnout can show up in different facets. I often think of burnout just happening with work because we live in such a hustle culture. But what about you, Matthew? How do you think of burnout?
Everything she just said, I'm too burned out to think of my own stuff. So, no, and I like that idea. I like even what you said, Sherry, with bringing that into the different domains of what we do. Marlene, like you, I've applied it more vocationally. I think vocationally is where it shows up a lot, or it has shown up a lot. When we have, and what I say, it's that confluence of physical, emotional, mental exhaustion, right? Like all three of those domains all hit us at the same time. And typically responding to overworking, but I think as well, Sherry, you were saying like our relationships that can show up. And as I've synergized a lot of this, it's almost when our being and our doing get to be so exhausted that we've lost sight of how to take those next steps. And I think that's where, going back to that whole burnout, like if you think of something that's burnt, there's no rekindling it, there's no pushing it, like that log is just spent. And I think that's really when you find yourself there, that's burnout.
Yeah. So I'm curious how one would describe, okay, so both of you kind of described that it can happen in different areas and it takes a toll on us mentally, physically, emotionally. How do we know when we're there? And how do we know, like, when have we passed over into this area? And are there markers that tell us, indicators that tell us, hey, you're on the road to it? Like, watch out.
I would say for us doers, you should assume that you're on the cusp of burnout at any given point. Because that hustle culture and that idea that, well, I'll just speak for myself. I always have so many projects and I am genuinely excited about every single one of them. And at any point, I can really kind of push myself over an edge. What happens when I'm burnt out is that I lose that enthusiasm for them, or I lose that focus, or I don't have the clarity to move forward on them.
I like that. So enthusiasm, focus, and clarity suffer or wane when you're when you've approached burnout?
Yeah. I think for me, one of the things I've really found, and just as we were starting this podcast, was when I hit my point of it's interesting because it's easy to tell when you're burnt out. I think it's harder to tell when you're burning out. I think a lot of us, we hit that point too late. That's what happened to me is, back in September, I was like, I was like, I think I need to take some time off because I was just struggling through a lot of these things that we're talking about. And then I started processing. I was like, oh, the last day I took off was in between Christmas and New Year the previous year. I was like, I don't know how often we're supposed to take vacations, but I'm pretty sure 9 months is a little too long, right? So like I knew, like no question, I'm way over that line. And I think one of the things we as helping professionals do is, really try to tune people in and look at some of the signs that get overlooked. And I think in ourselves, it's always like everything else, we're very myopic when it comes to our own stuff. Yeah, so you've got to catch it beforehand. Sorry.
Yeah, and that is so hard to do because, like you said, it's really hard to notice the indicators. I like Sherry's thing about these kind of more subtle markers of like when burnout's happening. I wonder what happens though when you're in it. What are some of the negative consequences of being in burnout? Like, what do people tend to do? I think about like overspending, for example, on like luxury things because I think that's going to help. But yeah.
Yeah, the overspending is kind of a good analogy to think about it. You have a bank account and you've taken out too much, and now your body, your mind, your emotions are saying, hey, there's a problem here. And that really could affect lots of different areas, not just money, but like thinking about it in that bank account. So in the burning out would be that cup is getting emptier, and the burnt out would be it's overdrawn.
I like that analogy.
Yeah. I think of, as we were talking about this, obviously by now everybody knows, I think in terms of movies, everything just confluences there. But the Rockies, or the Rocky movie, they're all the same movie, it's just repeated. But he gets to the end and he's throwing these heavy punches that have nothing, like there's really nothing behind it. There's no dodging, there's no artistry to it. It's just beating the air, just trying to get the last little vestiges. So I think that's really when you notice that, like that's a burnout, when you find yourself enacting that part of things. You come up with ideas, but you can't see them through. Everything is prickly, everything's on your nerves. For me, one of my big things is I notice when I'm not sleeping, when I avoid sleep, which ironically is the one thing you really need. Like I notice that my clients too, it's, they're just burning the candle at both ends and don't know why. And it's not productive time. You ask them like, what were you doing? It's just like, I was just trying to do this 5-minute project that took me 5 hours of staring at the screen. And I was like, welcome to burnout, and, so you see those things, right? So sleep problems, nervousness, procrastination, irritability, physical signs, right? We're having headaches, body aches, everything sucks. We hate everybody hates us kind of moments, great sign that we are over that line.
Well, these cluster of symptoms that you just described sound a lot like depression. And so I'm curious, how can you tell if you're burned out or depressed or both?
Well, certainly both is possible. And if you're already depressed, I think it's easier to get burnt out. So the difference to me is that depression is like if you are burnt out and you take a few days off and you really take care of yourself, you're going to feel a bounce back. And with depression, that's more persistent.
Yeah. Yes. Burned out, if somebody handed me a lottery ticket, I'd be like, woohoo, life is great. Depression, they hand me the lottery ticket and I'm like, meh, So it is more of the mental symptoms. And it's a true clinical condition, not just sadness, right? So.
Right. Well, and also what you're describing is that the money or maybe the time or the rest fixes it, but those things won't fix the depression per se. Like, So burnout is more distinguished by like, well, if I just got 2 weeks of time off, then I'd be all right. Like, that the remedy would solve what you're feeling.
Mm-hmm.
The remedy of time and rest or money.
Right. And likewise with depression, right? The remedy of therapy and medication and self-care can do that. And so it's applying the right fix to the right problem.
Right. And those can really work. They usually are going to take longer than that 2-week vacation or break.
Well, yeah, and so that kind of goes into my next question of like the difference between burnout and stress, or burnout and extreme burnout, because I know that a few days for a lot of us who feel burned out is simply just not enough. So how do we distinguish between, I guess let's start with burnout and extreme burnout.
Burnout and extreme burnout. I don't know if functionally we're going to be able to give a good definition or line there, because I think there's a personal aspect to burnout, and that really has to do with our reserves and how much we can handle and our expectations about the world. I think about when I had kids, and I had 3 kids in 3 years. Now, I was burnt out during a lot of their early years, and it also was expected that I would be burnt out during those years. So there's some element of what is the circumstance, and what are you like, what's that bigger purpose and reason that you're pushing yourself, and whether that is congruent with your values and ideals. Because if you're out of sync with those values and ideals, it's very, very hard to keep moving forward versus when you are in alignment. And then all of those sacrifices I made for my kids were absolutely worth it, even if I was burnt out while I was doing it.
Yeah, that's nice.
Yeah. And I think going back to a lot of that, it's with extreme burnout. I think it's when we just keep walking into the same situation again and again, not throwing shade on having 3 kids in 3 years. That's an amazing feat, right? So that's an empowering thing, right? But again, if you're burned out of the job and you take that time off and you rejuvenate, and then you roll right back in with the same expectations and the same process, continuing to be overworked, undervalued, then you're going to find yourself, I think, burning a lot quicker, because it's that second punch that just wears you down more and more. So I think until you take care, and going back to Sherry, like values clarification, what am I doing? What do I really want? Am I continuing to push myself in a job that doesn't value me doing things that I don't want to do for no reason? Right. Then like, this isn't a great place. And so I think that's where the extreme burnout comes in, because we just keep rolling through it. And again, I don't know if that it's really easy to measure, but it's one of those things we know when we see it.
So, I mean, burnout can still happen even if you're living into your values and finding purpose and meaning. And perhaps it's just allows you to continue a little bit more. But when you're now not in alignment, now you're working really hard, for example, in a company that you don't actually like, then it becomes unsustainable. Like you can't continue.
Right.
But like with Sherry's example, like having these children she was raising, like that was worth it, and that you could persist and continue.
Even and don't get me wrong, that was still burnout.
Yeah. And so I want to save actually how we recover from burnout for the next episode, because I feel like just distinguishing what it is so nuanced. So in more kind of narrowing down even further, let's talk about the difference between stress and burnout. What are those, and what do they look like?
All right, so stress can either be positive stress or negative stress. Generally, we don't think of positive stresses as being as stressful as negative. So positive stress would be like getting married or having a baby or winning the lottery. There's a lot of good with that, but there's still some stress, some tension, and need to put some energy towards figuring that out. And then you've got the negative stressors, which are things that just about any change that's unwanted, that would be negative. But also I don't know, arguing with your spouse, or having a kid who's pushing back on your boundaries, or losing your job, or even just your job not going well.
Mhm.
So all of those are stress, and the stress builds up to burnout. But if you work through the stress in little bits and you do a lot of self-care as you're going through the stress, then you can avoid that burnout.
So it's really layered, is what I'm hearing. Like that, I mean, stress can be a path to burnout, and it certainly makes you more vulnerable to having burnout.
Yeah. I think one of the concepts here is allostatic load, which is I believe an engineering term that we have stolen for mental health. I'm not sure. I have to go back and check that. But and it's really that ability for a structure to withstand stress. So, if we build a bridge, if we build a building, there's stressors on that, right? And they're not bad things, right? We need to have stressors, because if we don't, then the building collapses inward, or outward, or whatever word we don't want it to go, because we like for them to be built. Hence the reason why we call them buildings. But like, it's the system is designed to handle that at some point, right? And this is, we see this in our world all around us. Things happen that we don't expect: global pandemics, nature, weather, poor people in Buffalo now sitting with 23,000 feet of snow above them, right? Like, they weren't prepared. I mean, nobody's prepared for those strange things. And I think mental health wise, that happens with our stress too. And when the allostatic load, when we have too much stress beyond what our system can handle healthily, then that's when we're starting to enter in that world of burnout.
Mm. When is it time to make drastic or any kind of change when burnout happens? And I'm kind of going into the how we recover, but I guess what does it signal for us to do? Are there some universal things that we can do when burnout starts to happen?
I think the biggest thing is to recognize it first. I mean, that's the number one thing, because I think, again, because we're dealing with this continuum. I love the way we presented it today, right? Is we have stress, and we have depression that kind of factors in there, and then we have burnout, then we have extreme burnout. Right. So I think recognizing it, like, when is this coming in? Am I tuned into my body? Am I measuring my structures? Am I measuring, am I noticing what's going on with me? Right. As well as, and a lot of times I love the social game too, right? Like, let's look at our social circles. Are people feeling that stress? Are they seeing it in us? So I think any of those things, when we start to see that sign, it's a call to take action, which, let's use the check engine light metaphor, right? When the check engine light comes on, we don't have to, completely jump over the side of the freeway in the middle of things, but we need to find a good safe spot to kind of stop and measure what's going on. Is this a sensor that's failed? Is my oil currently all over 71? Right. So mental health wise, like, what's going on and what do I need? And I know that I think maybe I'm going to flirt with that line, because I know next week we're going to really handle it. But I think that's that moment of we have to apply a fix.
All of those are kind of the internal measures, but I think we also get a lot of feedback from our environment. If every time I'm with my husband, I'm snappy and he's irritated with me, that's probably a sign that something's not going well, and that might be burnout. Or if I'm trying to get my kids ready in the morning and I end up yelling at them too many days in a row, or we all walk out the door crying, like, that's a lot of feedback from the environment. I guess another example would be going to work and then not really getting much done. Like, that again is feedback that I really need to look at what's going on and see if I'm feeling empty, and then, look for that check engine light.
So this kind of leads me to my next question, which is, is burnout inevitable? It seems like, I mean, of course, we can't be automatons and robots and carry on with this level of productivity and niceness and kindness all the time. Like it's just not going to happen that way. And so I wonder, like, are we just, you said earlier, we should just expect burnout, especially if you're in a helping field. But I mean, is truly burnout inevitable? I mean, it seems to affect us, affect a lot of people, I would say.
It
Probably.
does. And I think this goes back to our culture. We
Mhm.
do live in hustle. For most of us, we live in a hustle culture, and we're always trying to get more done and be more productive. That isn't necessarily bad that you want to get more done, but it really has to be balanced with that recovery time and that quiet, so that we can keep that grounding. I think even, and I'll just throw this out, I don't know how popular this idea is. Our culture really supports us numbing rather than actually rejuvenating. So things
Mm,
like scrolling through social media
Mm.
or watching TV for hours, but not really being engaged,
mm,
or even playing games, either
mm,
apps or video games where you're just kind of zoned out. So
mm.
it's not just the workload, it's not just the productivity, but it's also that we don't really do things that are help us recover.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great wisdom there. I think obviously I think we're gonna see more of this in our high achievers, the people who are constantly driven to do something better. And so I think for people like that, I think burnout is, I hate the term inevitable, but I think we're okay using it for this. Maybe not completely like that extreme sense, but we're gonna have that, like that part where we just out exceed our limitations.
Mhm.
Um, I do think there are also people, and I maybe we commonly refer to them in as A and B type personalities, but I think that might be an oversimplification. But I think there's maybe some wisdom in like a mindful practice of just taking those moments out, being in the moment, being present, and kind of maybe even trying to balance out some of that work. I think that might be the key to really just checking in with this process.
Yeah. I like that, returning to your body and checking in. I know that I, for example, can get really burned out with screens because
Mhm.
now I work remotely. And so my eyes get very tired. And you're right, I can recover and rejuvenate if I just look out into the distance, usually out the window for
Mhm.
a while. And then I can like feel better. Literally, my eyes begin to feel better.
Mhm.
Um, and so it can be simple like that. But then I want to talk about one other thing we didn't discuss, which is burnout and laziness. And how do you know when someone's complaining about burnout that they're just not using that as an excuse to not do work or on yourself? And I hate the word laziness personally, but I'm curious what you all have to say about burnout and laziness.
Well, I think laziness is something that is put on people. We don't usually call ourselves lazy, or if we do, it's not with the same purpose or meaning. Um, we usually know in ourselves why we're not getting things done,
Mm,
or we at least know that that information is there. So that term laziness is usually that judgment from other. Now, sometimes that other is in our head and
Mhm.
we've taken on someone else's voice, and that voice says, "Oh, you didn't get enough done today. You're lazy."
mm, mhm,
Versus saying, "Oh, I did so much today and I didn't get everything done. And that's because my list was longer than my day, or because I had a part of my project that derailed it, or because I had pushed too hard and my body is just, it's shut down and it's not going to let me keep pushing through."
Yeah, absolutely. So, and applying that to that situation, situationally, I like that idea of maybe not receiving what people throw at us, but weighing it out again, going back to that mindful approach. My son just got back from a weekend long trip where it was himself and 1,000 teenagers with a big event, and I love my little neurodivergent guy, and I owe him some money for this, for using him as an example. Licensing fees, right? He's a shrewd businessman. um and but he went through this big, like, constantly out, constantly going, doing a lot of stuff that he wasn't comfortable with, outside of his comfort zone. And so when he got back Sunday, he basically just went into complete shutdown mode, and like we didn't see him all day. It was him in a book. He didn't even do a lot of screen time. It was just just quiet, taking it easy. And I think a lot of times we look at that as an isolated incident, right? There's that internal monologue, like he's so lazy, he's not doing anything, but recognizing when we look at the grand scheme of things, he was doing exactly what we should all do, and be tuned in enough to know that it's a refractory period, right? We're going to just kind of chill, draw ourselves back in so that we can manage the long haul of this race.
That is such a good analogy too. Thank you both for the examples you gave. And I wanted to ask one last question around burnout is how do you know when burnout's indicating that you should, sometimes it can be all or nothing is what I'm saying. I think some of our listeners be like, I'm burned out, I should just quit. I'm burned out of this relationship, I should just leave it. And how do we know when like burnout is indicating that perhaps, yes, maybe we should leave the job, maybe we should leave the relationship, maybe we should make some drastic changes, or when it's like, okay, I've entered all or nothing thinking and perhaps it doesn't need to be so drastic.
I think going back to the example earlier about just rolling back into the punches, right? If we take time away from something and we come back into it and the situation has not changed, right? If our internal situation hasn't changed, if the external situation has not changed and will not change, right? And this is going to be personal for everybody, right? So a lot of times we have to take that risk of asking for change. And Sherry, I'm going to probably lob that one over to you, because I think relationally that can really weigh in, right? But like if that system is still going to maintain that same pacing and there's no even exchange to try to change it, right? There's no attempt, there's no mutual problem anyway, whatever's there, then I think that's probably that good time to say, all right, I need to move myself and I need to try something different. But you're doing it out of a position of empowerment and mindfulness, not out of a position of fear and loss.
I think that burnout is the beginning of a conversation with yourself. Burnout doesn't actually tell you anything except that you need to look at the situation and decide whether you need to make some changes or not. There isn't like, I'm in burnout, here's now what you're supposed to do. It's I'm in burnout, self, what's going on? Is this out of alignment? Am I putting too much of myself in this? Am I not planning enough recovery time or enough self-care so that I have the resources to do this?
I like that. So it is the beginning of a conversation, ask some more reflective questions to then help you discern what's actually needed. And like Matthew said, sometimes if you've discerned that nothing's going to change, well, then that's good information. So what are your quick takeaways and how can people get a hold of you if they'd like to work with you?
Well, my quick takeaway is don't get burnout. I don't know. I think we were talking about high achievers before, and I think that really we need to always be kind of on the lookout for whether we are giving too much, whether we are overextending ourselves, so that we're kind of monitoring that at all times, not just kind of thinking that I'm going to think about that in the future, but think about that today, think about that tomorrow, think about that the next day.
Right.
I think for me, with my highly sensitive peeps, the one thing I will just keep rolling back into is making sure that we are empathizing with ourselves. And Sherry, I may shamelessly steal that about having a conversation with ourselves. It's our sign that we need to do that. But I think with my highly sensitives, my NDs, like this is, that's that great time to weigh this out and include yourself in that conversation, right? Of, what do you need in this process? And that way you can either avoid the burnout or you can recover from it faster.
I think what I'm taking away too is thinking about burnout being on a spectrum, and that just awareness of like will help it tell me what I need based on where I am on that spectrum. And that there's some vulnerability factors that contribute to burnout for sure. And how can people, our listeners, get a hold of you? What are you offering right now?
For me, I love this. This is so beautifully timely because I just had a friend of mine who's he's a pastor, and he approached needing some help for particularly clergy who are struggling with burnout in this. We did it anyway, but obviously post-pandemic time, and so we were able to kind of put our heads together, and so we've creating a program where we can really help clergy who are feeling this burnout process, find mutual support, as well as get a lot of free stuff from me, just trying to just continue to give back from a system that I struggled with as well. And so that's at misfitrefuge.com/pastor is the direct way, or you can just go to the website misfitrefuge.com, and there's a link there at the top.
Great.
That
Thank
sounds
you,
really
Matthew.
amazing.
Mhm.
Well, I'm at sherrytimco.com. And I think that this idea of burnout, when you apply it to relationships, you can really see that relationship burnout during, and after the pandemic, when couples spent a lot of time together and things didn't go as well as maybe they thought it would. But
Mhm.
also that maybe roommate syndrome, where it feels like you're just living with your partner and you're not really engaged with them, that there's a level of burnout there as well. I
Mhm.
hadn't thought about it exactly in those terms until now, but I think I'm going to put some more thought into that because maybe that is a different variety or version of burnout, just
Mhm.
relational burnout.
And likewise, Sherry. And so how do they, sherrytimco.com?
Yes.
Excellent. Yeah, I was thinking about, the single population that I often work with, and how being single can get old. And there's a lot of burnout there. And I've created a 3-step guide for how to deal with loneliness, because that is part of that burnout. And also, if you're online dating, I have created a guide to help you kind of navigate that, get on and do it well, and get off, hopefully quickly. And you can go to coachmarlena.com for that. So anyway, thank you both for this conversation. Next week, we'll talk about how to recover from burnout.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye, everybody.